Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining Tokyo College Lecture Series. My name is Yuki TERADA, Project Assistant Professor of Tokyo College, and I am the moderator for today's session. The title of today's lecture is The UK's Indo-Pacific Tilt, What Changed in 2022? I am pleased to welcome today's speaker, Professor Alastair Morgan, Ushioda Fellow of Tokyo College. Professor Alastair Morgan was the coordinator of the United Nations 1874 panel of experts on the Democratic People of the People's Republic of Korea sanctions from 2019 to 2021. He was previously British Consul General in Guangzhou and Director of Trade and Investment at the British Embassy in Beijing. As for today's session, we will begin the lecture by Professor Morgan for about 30 minutes. We will then hear a comment about 15 minutes by Professor Ken Endo from Graduate Schools for Law and Politics, the University of Tokyo. Professor Endo is an expert of international politics, EU, and security studies. And the remaining time will be used for discussion. And if we have time, we will also have a short Q&A session. So one quick note for the audience, please use the Q&A function in the Zoom and write your questions and send them to us while listening. So Professor Morgan, the floor is yours.
Well, Dr. TERADA, thank you very much indeed for your kind introduction. And thank you, Professor Endo, for coming to join this event. And thank you, everybody who's watching. And I hope later participating by asking questions. I'm not very good at time discipline, so I can't promise that I will speak for less than 30 minutes, but actually that is my intention. I should say before I start how grateful I am to Tokyo College for providing me with a platform, and also how grateful I am to Tokyo College for having me in the first place as a fellow of the college. I'd also like to thank the Graduate School of Public Policy, who arranged for me to give a course on contemporary British foreign policy towards Asia. And I should thank my students for taking the course and for their ideas. And if any of them hear their ideas reflected today, I hope they'll take it as flattery and not as plagiarism. I'm going to talk about what happened in 2022 in relation to the UK's Indo-Pacific tilt, because I've already given a talk a year ago about the UK's Indo-Pacific tilt, and that lecture is recorded, and I would encourage you, if you're interested in the subject, to find it on the Tokyo College site and to go through it there. I spoke for rather longer that time than I'm planning to do so today. But clearly, to start off talking about what happened in 2022, for those of you who haven't seen the previous lecture and who aren't familiar with everything to do with the UK's tilt to the Indo-Pacific, I should give a little bit of introduction. Every 5 years or so, the British government publishes a strategic review which sets out strategy for diplomacy, for defense and security, for development, and for related issues. And the last integrated review covering those areas was published by the British government in 2021. That's actually slightly more than 5 years following the previous review because it got delayed by the COVID pandemic. And in the integrated review, which sets out in great detail Britain's strategy in those areas with particular actions for the years to come and a longer term vision beyond that, the government announced that it was going to have what it called a tilt to the Indo-Pacific. And the tilt to the Indo-Pacific was announced in the context of a policy which is, if you like, the policy of promoting the UK as global Britain. And global Britain was a concept that was adopted following Brexit, but sometime before the publication of the integrated report, the review. And the terms global Britain are not strictly defined, but really it's intended to encapsulate the notion that the United Kingdom is a European nation, but with global interests. The British government would say uniquely global interests. But of course, there are other European nations that also have interests that span the globe. And within that context, the UK announced the tilt to the Indo-Pacific, which meant devoting more resources, giving some more focus to the Indo-Pacific region in all those areas that I've already mentioned. And the precise coverage of the Indo-Pacific region was not defined in the integrated review, but in emphasizing why the Indo-Pacific region mattered to the United Kingdom, some statements were made about it, that it included more than half the population of the world, that it included countries that accounted for, or territories that accounted for 40% or more of global GDP, that it was going to be the region that would have the greatest growth over the coming years following the review, greater than North America, greater than Europe, indeed greater than those two areas combined. And for that reason, the region mattered greatly to the United Kingdom for the economy and for economic opportunity, but the Indo-Pacific region also mattered in terms of security and defense. Britain's security was affected by the Indo-Pacific region, partly because security issues could affect shipping going through the region, and a lot of global trade passed through it. Something like 17.5% of the UK's trade was with the region as it defined it, but also because of challenges and flashpoints in the region. And those challenges and flashpoints relating, among others, to the threat to peace and security posed by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, and by the greatest geopolitical development of the time, which is the rise of China, but China as a state with different values from the UK, and of course a completely different political constitution, if you like. And that is another way in which the Indo-Pacific is identified as mattering to the UK, because the integrated review emphasized the values of the UK, democracy, support for human rights and others, and if you like, the rule of law, rule-based international order, and supporting the rule-based international order from challenges, but also in the Indo-Pacific, working with countries who were developing new rules in new trade agreements for digital trade and so on. Now, at the time the review came out, there was some criticism of the concept of global Britain as being poorly defined, but also in some eyes as looking back to an earlier age, the age of empire, and really being, if you like, hubristic, having a degree of overreach that was beyond the capability of the United Kingdom in its international projection and role in 2021 and onwards. There were also those who criticized the Indo-Pacific tilt in the economic area, because they felt that cultivating new trade arrangements, having trade agreements with the countries of the Indo-Pacific was not going to be a substitute for the damage done by Brexit. That was the view of those who opposed Brexit in terms of the barriers put up to trade with the European Union. There were also those who questioned the economic capability of the United Kingdom to sustain a tilt to the Indo-Pacific. However, I think that in the way that it was set out in the integrated review, the tilt is quite clear. It makes it very clear, for instance, that the UK is fundamentally a European nation and that its greatest security concerns rest in the North Atlantic Euro theatre. So it is not abandoning that theatre. It's not a tilt to the Indo-Pacific at the expense of geography. And it made clear that there were some very specific moves that it was going to try to make, that the United Kingdom government was going to try to make in relation to the Indo-Pacific that were achievable. And I ran through last year some of the achievements that were realized in 2021. And I'll just do that very quickly now in summary, because this is all available in the talk that I gave last year. So the United Kingdom deployed its aircraft carrier, the Queen Elizabeth, in a carrier strike group, which was the largest British naval deployment to the region for decades, really, and had been long in the planning. The aircraft carrier was commissioned in the 1990s. The UK managed to achieve free trade agreements with many countries around the world, but including in the region with the Republic of Korea, with Singapore, with Japan, with Australia, with New Zealand, and with others. And some of those agreements went beyond the agreements that had previously existed with the European Union, and some of them indeed were entirely new. The UK achieved its ambition of becoming a dialogue partner with ASEAN in 2021, and it launched its application to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. At the end of my talk last year, I did, however, identify 9 risks to the tilt to the Indo-Pacific. And some of those remain very relevant, but are really, if you like, integral to risks that arise from engagement in the Indo-Pacific. So, for instance, I spoke about the risk of being caught up in conflict, perhaps particularly conflict related to the Taiwan Strait. And that's something we might talk about later. But the 2 risks that I want to return to now were the ones that I identified as the prime risks, which were the state of the British economy and whether the UK would have the resources to carry through its tilt to the Indo-Pacific. And I used the word events, which is a reference to a statement by the former Prime Minister Harold Macmillan about what would derail or what were the challenges for leadership. And he said, events, dear boy, events. The unforeseen or the foreseen but hard to handle contingency. And I think in 2022, both of those areas have really realized themselves. And I'm going to talk about 3 areas. So I'm going to talk about the economy, and I'm going to talk about politics, British domestic politics in relation to events, and then I'm going to talk about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And after I gave my lecture a year ago, Professor Yuki of GRASP responded, and in her response, with considerable foresight, she asked about the risks relating to Ukraine and whether a war in Ukraine could derail the tilt to the Indo-Pacific. This wasn't recorded, but my response to that was that it could, but that I thought that the way the tilt had been set out, it could be realized even if there were a war in Ukraine, which at that time I personally did not foresee. So looking first at British political leadership and British politics, and you will recall, I think, or you'll be aware that in 2022, the UK had 3 prime ministers. This is an extremely unusual period of political turmoil in the UK. And the turmoil actually predated the departure of Boris Johnson as Prime Minister in July. He was followed by Liz Truss from September to October for a record short period as Prime Minister of 50 days. And then in October, following the resignation of Liz Truss, we have our current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. And of course, the challenge of so much political turmoil is that it is a distraction from other events. It's a distraction from a focus on foreign policy. And I think you saw that, for instance, in questions when Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister of whether he would actually be able to travel overseas to attend the COP26, the COP27 climate change conference in Egypt in the late autumn, or indeed attend the G20 summit in Indonesia. In fact, he did go to both, but it's indicative of the disorder and the domestic pressures that the question arose. I think another issue that has arisen is a lack of or a loss of electoral support or popularity for the Conservative government, and increased focus on the policies of the opposition Labour Party. Under the British electoral system, the latest date when there can be a general election, the next general election, is January 2025. So it's quite likely that the current government, which does have a majority, a large majority, will continue for around 2 more years. But even so, people are looking to see what are the policies of the Labour government. And in relation to the Indo-Pacific tilt, the shadow foreign secretary, the Labour spokesman on foreign policy, does not use the word tilt, but has made it clear that the heart of the policy, the focus on the Indo-Pacific because of its importance for the UK, is likely to continue. Of course, it's hard to say now what the government's policy might be in 2025, but continuity is likely. Within the differences between the 3 prime ministers that the UK had in 2022, the major differences related to economic policy, particularly between Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, and I'll come back to that. But there was some difference in terms of the focus on the Indo-Pacific. And in particular, there was a perception that Liz Truss might be more hawkish in relation to China than was the case with Rishi Sunak as a former finance minister or former chancellor. But I'm not sure that that is the case. Liz Truss, however, in her brief period in office, did decide that the integrated review published in 2021 needed to be updated, and she announced actually that there would be an update published by the end of last year. Because of the political changes, that has now been postponed, but Rishi Sunak has kept the plan to have an update published early this year, early 2023. In announcing the need for an update, the Prime Minister, Liz Truss, drew attention particularly to the war in Ukraine and the consequences of that. But in discussion behind the scenes and to some extent in public, it was clear that also she wanted to focus on whether the integrated review was robust enough in its approach towards China. Rishi Sunak, as Prime Minister, in his first large speech in November as Prime Minister covering foreign policy, did make clear that the focus on the Indo-Pacific remained a core part of foreign policy, though he didn't actually use the word tilt to the Indo-Pacific himself. And all the leaders of the party have made clear that the commitment of the British government to support Ukraine is unwavering, and that they will, the commitment will remain until the war is completed. Liz Truss's Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, who is still the Foreign Secretary now, made a foreign policy speech in September in which he talked about maintaining the tilt to the Indo-Pacific and set out the reasons why, despite the war in Ukraine, it continues to be important. I'm not going to be able to complete what I was going to say in 30 minutes, so I must apologize for that. I'm going to go on beyond 30 minutes, but let me now turn quickly to the economy. And just to say that while the economy has recovered from the dire position that we experienced in the United Kingdom in 2020, when we had the largest fall in GDP for 300 years, the economy remains in a poor condition. The Bank of England forecasts that there will be a small recession this year, 2023, and the IMF actually forecasts that the United Kingdom will be the only major economy to experience negative growth in 2023. And those forecasts are not always right, but clearly that's not good news. The government's debt remains high. It is now slightly under 100% of GDP, having been more than 100%. And while that figure is not actually exceptionally high, if you look at G7 economies, it is very high in historical terms, recent historical terms for the United Kingdom, and it's high in comparison with many European countries or the EU average. And the cost of borrowing is now high, including the government's cost of borrowing. The Bank of England has just raised its base rate to 4%. And all of this means that there are fewer resources available for public expenditure. And so they do call into question the ability to finance programs, including in relation to the tilt to the Indo-Pacific, while the demands on the public purse grow and grow. And in particular, following the COVID pandemic, there is a huge demand in relation to the public health service. I'm not going to talk about the budget which actually led to the demise of the Liz Truss government, in the interests of time. But what it did do, because it had to be recast, was show that the government is not able to borrow unlimitedly from the international markets, and that it cannot fund its programs through tax cuts without identifying how they are going to be covered. Nevertheless, although this budget was failed and was reversed, the objective of the budget under Liz Truss was to try to achieve growth. And the issue of how the United Kingdom can achieve growth remains a pressing political issue, and there's still actually considerable demand for tax cuts, but we can turn to that later. But let me cover briefly the consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. And this is an era-defining illegal war by President Putin. And of course, the war is still unfolding, and the consequences of the war remain unknown, whether that's escalation in terms of the weapons used, escalation beyond Ukraine and the risk of that, or the continued relentless fight within Ukraine and the ultimate consequences of that. As I have said, there is no question about the commitment of the British government to supporting Ukraine, and in terms of aid provided to Ukraine as a country, the UK, if you look at humanitarian, financial, and defense aid, has provided more as an individual country than any country other than the United States. Though if you look at the European Union collectively, the figure is much greater collectively. I'm just going to do this as headlines, and there is much here to discuss. But of course, the war in Ukraine has raised very significant questions about military capability, including the UK's military capability. One of the things the war has shown is the rate through which the Ukrainians, but also the Russians, have got through munitions and ammunition. And that raises questions about the stockpile, which has been depleted by aid which has been given, but also whether the stockpile is in any case adequate. Of course, it raises bigger questions about defense and deployment. It certainly brings home the importance of the North Atlantic European security theatre as the main security theatre for the United Kingdom. In some ways, I think that the war has actually restored a degree of confidence and credibility. Credibility in the UK in terms of its support for Ukraine, credibility in terms of the importance of British intelligence, but also confidence and credibility in the way the UK's commitment to defense in Europe has been borne out, and the UK has shown that it has worked with EU member states, but also with the Commission in terms of sanctioning Russia. And I think that has and indeed has joined new organizations like the European Political Community, if you want to call it an organization, which President Macron set up. The war has had enormous consequences for the domestic economy of the United Kingdom in terms of fuel security and inflation, and the fueling of price pressures, and the cost of providing assistance to Ukraine, I think, affects the availability of aid from the United Kingdom to expend in other areas, and really calls into question the ability of the UK to increase its focus on its aid budget in the Indo-Pacific region. But despite that, in general, I would say that the war has not undermined the focus on the Indo-Pacific for a number of reasons, which I'm sure after Professor ENDO has spoken, we can discuss further. I mean, the first is that the reasons for the focus on the Indo-Pacific in terms of the economic prospects are unchanged. Obviously, there are economic consequences of the war that have affected the Indo-Pacific as well, but the growth prospects, the population prospects, the GDP prospects remain in that region. But also, I think there are new concerns relating to China's support for Russia and the unlimited partnership that Xi Jinping and Putin announced shortly before the invasion of Ukraine, which show how important it is to continue to focus on the region and how security issues in one region may affect another region. There's also a need to ensure that there is a community of views with what you might call the non-aligned countries or the global south, who do not necessarily automatically share the perception of the war in Ukraine that is shared between NATO allies. And that is again a reason for focusing on the region. And of course, there is a concern that there is an analogous risk in the region, particularly in relation to China and Taiwan, where China has not forsworn the possibility of using force to unite Taiwan with the PRC. Of course, there are differences in relation to the PRC and Taiwan and Russia and Ukraine, and I don't want to suggest that I'm abandoning the one China policy, which is British government policy, as it is the government policy of many others. But the risk remains there, and the determination to avert and to deter the use of force against Taiwan, or the risk of the use of force against Taiwan, and to have peaceful processes is very strong. And I think even if the war in Ukraine has not changed Chinese perception of its attitude towards Taiwan and military action in relation to Taiwan, and I can't say whether it has or it hasn't. Of course, those risks pre-existed the war in Ukraine. So that is a very, very brief reference to some of the issues, including issues related to the Indo-Pacific raised by the war in Ukraine. Clearly, this is a subject which we could discuss for hours, and any one of those issues, there will be people far more knowledgeable than I am. So I apologize if anything I've said seems zhejian or naive. I want to touch in the remaining 5 or 10 minutes of what I'm going to say on just a few other points. And the first relates to peace and security in the Indo-Pacific region and how the UK has reacted to that. And I've already spoken about the Taiwan Strait, but of course, in the summer, the Speaker of the US House of Representatives visited Taiwan, and China responded to that with military exercises, missile launches, and other actions. And in response to that, the British government summoned the Chinese ambassador in the United Kingdom to seek an explanation of China's action and to emphasize values and the importance of peaceful resolution of issues. And following the visit, there have been a number of visits by the US Speaker Pelosi. There have been a number of visits to Taiwan by British MPs and one government minister. A British government minister for trade visited Taiwan. China criticized this as contrary to the One China policy. But although the UK does not recognize Taiwan and does acknowledge the One China policy, Taiwan is a separate customs entity with a presence in the WTO, and the UK has long held trade talks with Taiwan, and the visit by the British Minister for Trade was no different in Britain's perspective. And there's also been a visit by the Foreign Affairs Committee leader and members of Parliament. That is not a British government visit. It was strongly criticized by the Chinese, but it was, although it's not a British government visit, the right of members of Parliament or Diet members to visit Taiwan was supported by the government, as is the right of British government or British MPs to speak about such issues. The second area that I want to mention in terms of defense and security threats in the Indo-Pacific has been the resumption by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea of missile launches up to intermediate launches over Japan, and the resumption of ICBM launches. And the UK remains committed to being the non-regional partner most engaged in tackling this through its role on the Security Council and through sanctions. But of course, the operation of the Security Council in this area is actually paralyzed by the polarization between China and Russia and the other Security Council members. I won't say more about that because of time. Now, in 2022, the United Kingdom has not had in the defense and security area anything quite on the scale of the deployment of the carrier strike group in 2021, but it has followed through on its commitment to have 2 offshore patrol vessels permanently in the region, and that has been important for the UK to be able to participate in joint exercises, in monitoring of DPRK sanctions evasion, and in other activity. I think in terms of the defense commitment to the region, we will have to see what happens in the following through of other commitments for lethal maritime force with a littoral response group planned for this year and frigates for the future. But I have no reason to assume that those won't go ahead. I would mention, and we can talk more about them because I think they're very important, other areas of defense cooperation in 2022, continuing work with Australia and the United States on AUKUS, covering not just the supply to Australia or the construction by Australia of nuclear-propelled submarines with conventional weapons or for conventional weapons, on which an announcement is expected in March, but also other areas of cooperation, undersea technologies, quantum, artificial intelligence, advanced cyber, hypersonics, and electronic weapons. And I think this arrangement is significant for Australia, but also significant for the United Kingdom. And I will just mention, and again, we may want to return to them because they are important, two major announcements in terms of the cooperation between the United Kingdom and Japan, which are the commitment between the UK, Italy, and Japan to develop a global combat air program, which is very important for the defense industries of all those countries, and the agreement of a reciprocal access agreement, which is an agreement to do with the status of forces if British forces serve in Japan or Japanese forces take part in activity in the United Kingdom. And these are important agreements which follow through on the program of agreements that the UK has been developing with Japan in the defense sphere since 2012. And so despite the challenges politically in both countries, but particularly in the United Kingdom in 2022, that program has been followed through. In the economic sphere, the UK did not achieve its stated target of entering the CPTPP by the end of 2022, but the progress of negotiations is in train, and the UK has actively been pursuing negotiations for a free trade agreement with India, and has focused quite considerably on a partnership agreement with Indonesia, reflecting in part Indonesia's role as G20 chairman in 2022, but also its coming chairmanship of ASEAN, and has also been working to develop extend beyond trade agreements already reached, negotiations, for instance, with the Republic of Korea to go into the area of digital trade, which is already covered with Singapore and with Japan. I'm just going to list a number of other developments which I think are relevant to the UK's Indo-Pacific tilt, but which concern others. The first was the publication in 2022 of the Biden administration's strategy for the Indo-Pacific. I won't go into it in detail, partly because it actually is very much in line with a speech that the US Secretary of State made in 2021, which I touched on last time. But other countries have followed through with strategies, including Canada and the Republic of Korea. And so it emphasizes that among like-minded countries and allies, the focus on having a strategy for the Indo-Pacific continues. We could talk about NATO and the new NATO concept, which refers to China, but also to the Indo-Pacific, but also the fact that the Republic of Korea and Japan attended the NATO summit in 2022. And of course, the Secretary General of NATO has just been visiting the region. And I think that that is underlines the point I was making about the importance of the region for NATO in respect of the response to Ukraine, but also the connected nature of risk and threat. I'm not going to talk about them, but we could talk about the Biden administration's policy on legislation to deal with inflation reduction and semiconductors, providing great support for the American industries, which has been a challenge for like-minded countries in Europe, but also in this region, American industries in semiconductors and in green technologies, and which risks fragmenting some of the much closer alliance and cooperation that we've seen within NATO, within the G7 in 2022 under the Biden administration. And of course, there are many other issues in the region that we could refer to, but I'll pass over. I just want to mention 4 British developments, again, very, very quickly. One of them, I think, that you will be completely familiar with, which is the fact that the British legislation to ensure security of the critical national infrastructure has come into force. And in 2022, we saw the first orders made under that legislation, which included prohibitions on Chinese investment in the area of semiconductors. The 3 other areas that I want to mention are less obvious, but one is the publication of the census results for England and Wales, for the census taken in 2021, which showed that the population of England and Wales identifying as Asian had risen from 7.5% to 9.3% in the 10 years since the previous census. And I think that this is important in terms of a tilt within the UK population and the implications for people-to-people links between the United Kingdom and particularly South Asia. I also wanted to mention that while the UK remains very reliant on Chinese students in British universities, for the first time, actually, the number of student visas granted to Indian applicants exceeded visas granted to Chinese applicants in 2022. So there is some, if you like, rebalancing there. And I want to refer to, but I won't discuss, an important statement that was made under the Truss government, which is that the British government is entering into negotiations with Mauritius about the exercise of sovereignty over the Chagos Islands, where there is the large military base on the British Indian Ocean territory, the Diego Garcia base. Now that base and the operation of the base by the Americans and the United Kingdom will not be affected by these negotiations, but it resolves or looks to resolve early this year an issue where the United Kingdom has been criticized for being acting against international law in terms of a claim to sovereignty. The UK disputes that, but it's important in terms of the relationship with Mauritius, but also for putting the UK on moral high ground in challenging claims in the East China Seas or South China Seas, for example, that are not based on international law. And just to finish, I wanted to say a couple of words in memoriam. Firstly, to recall the assassination of Prime Minister Abe, and it was Prime Minister Abe who promulgated the concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific, which is reflected in the UK's tilt to the Indo-Pacific, and of course to recall the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, who was, as well as being the monarch in the United Kingdom, was the head of the Commonwealth and sovereign of a number of Commonwealth countries in the region. And Her Majesty's funeral was an occasion for diplomacy involving nations across the region and others, of course. But of course, it then also raises issues about Commonwealth ties and the monarchy. But Her Majesty was an exemplar to us all in outstanding public service until 2 days before her death. Remarkable. And I'd like to end on that note. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Professor Morgan, for providing us with such a detailed observation and overview of what happened in the globe in 2022. So before we move on to discussion, now we have a comment from Professor Endo. So Professor Endo, please.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed for having me here. I myself was educated in England with fond memories here and there. And thank you very much, Professor Morgan, for this remarkably concise review of the recent development. You yourself is a former diplomat with deep experience and knowledge of this region. You have covered basically everything of these of those developments, and I'm quite impressed by that. And then all these talks by Professor Morgan point to the tilt, sustained activism by the United Kingdom in this region of Indo-Pacific. And it seems to me sort of systematic, starting from the strategic military aspect to the economic side, in itself sustained by the sort of structural changes, the gravity of the world shifting to this region. So it's not just sort of negativity filling the hole of the Brexit, and then they finding somewhere else to play a role. But this is sustained by the sort of structural shift. Now, I basically prepare the small PPT file, and could you put into the next slide, please? We can put it all, thanks. And I would like to first discuss with you before going into the detail of this tilt stuff about this general situation here in this part of the world, with two focuses, one Taiwan and another DPRK. Starting from Taiwan, I myself, I have two minds basically. Always, one is that this is sort of risky. If we look at the war in Ukraine, that showed the risk if we have three things combined. One, the appetite for changing status quo, and capability to forces to change that status quo, and the deepening dictatorship. When these three factors are combined, it could be quite risky. This is brutal invasion by Russian into Ukrainian territory was sustained by these three things. And then if we look at this part of the world, China has exactly these three things: the appetite for changing status quo, and increasing capacity to change the status quo, and the deepening dictatorship in Beijing. Somebody referred to the third time re-election of Mr. Xi Jinping as the birth of the Xi Jinping dynasty. So it's not just one-party dictatorship, but this is one-person dictatorship. So it's qualitatively different. But and then China has never given up the Taiwan, and with growing military forces under Mr. Xi Jinping. So but it's not but that cannot be translated into the directly into the the immediate prospect of having the outright attack to the Taiwan territory, full-scale attack, the invasion to Taiwan. The U.S. itself is divided. If we look at the Admiral Davidson's remark, invasion might occur within 6 years. At the same time, General Milley, the chief of the Joint Chief of Staff, remarked that the China lacks capabilities. There's no reason for China to do that Taiwan invasion militarily. And if we look into detail of the potential military operation, the Taiwan invasion by China would require 1 million landing men or perhaps women with heavy equipment, the foods, the tanks and all sorts of things, which would be translated into the shipping capability of 20 million tons, which doesn't exist on the continent. And if we look at the say China's the space military capability, I just overheard that the China couldn't detect that the Pelosi aircraft coming to Taiwan. They lost somewhere in between. They couldn't follow up. So their capability may not be fully fledged. If we look at the 5th generation fighter jets, if we combine Taiwanese, US, Japanese one, may not be enough for China. And the missiles, yes, they may have, but if we look at the Ukrainian war, the anti-missile defense shield functions to some extent. Something like 70 to 80% are neutralized. So perhaps we shouldn't exaggerate the prospect of this Taiwan risk. Unless Taiwan declares independence, and probably there will be no war in the immediate future. So I just wondered, yes, the tilt of United States Kingdom to this region is partially, the reasons on the ground that the China may be a risk, especially with this Taiwan, possible Taiwan contingencies. But to what extent that is reasonable to suppose that there will be a sort of some Taiwan contingencies in the near future? Now, if we look at the DPRK, yes, it's worrisome. They have developed systematically, nuclear weapons, missile capabilities, and so on. And but at the same time, it seems to me that the aim of their development of these nukes and missiles, it is to basically to protect their regime, Kim dynasty, basically. But at the same time, again, it's even more worrisome that they have started to acquire the tactical nuclear weapons, and I just wonder if how we should characterize this DPRK's actions. Is it to point to this sort of protecting the this status quo, or they are by nature, the Korean Peninsula is divided into two parts. So by nature, they are aspiring to unify the peninsula. So, is it aiming at the changing the status quo? So I'd like to ask about the scope of North Korean aggressiveness, because you served as ambassador in Pyongyang, so you should know better. Now, these two are about the general situation. May I, could you turn the page? I'd like to, this is sort of mix of the comments and questions so that you can freely react afterward. And the UK sustained activism in this Indo-Pacific is warmly welcome, and it's in my eyes, it's quite remarkable that this tilt is so systematic. The exemplified by the dispatching of those vessels, inclusive of aircraft carriers, AUKUS, as you mentioned, and the the CPTPP application and so on. And if we look at the bilateral relations between Japan and Great Britain, it can be seen as a sort of another golden era. Since the time of the Anglo-Japanese alliance at the beginning of 20th century. But at the same time, I still wonder, and many people wonder, yes, this sort of activism is grounded by the fact that the gravity of the world is shifting to this part, and Britain is in search of the global role, and this part fits that profile. But as you emphasize, the UK is a European nation, and you have a more immediate concerns in the immediate neighborhood, starting from the distracted trade with Europe, refugees, fisheries, many other things, and let alone the war in Ukraine. Is there anything that we could identify? Is there anything inside the United Kingdom? I didn't mention in this slide, but as far as I know, inside the Great Britain, there is growing concern on the increasingly assertive China, perhaps from mid 2010s or perhaps later, intensified during the COVID-19 period crisis, because there are lots of fake news is coming from China, and perhaps Hong Kong, Uyghur, and things like this. So is there sort of any sustained sort of growing negative attitude toward China inside the United Kingdom amongst the public opinions? Or is there any active sort of mediating political groups like China Research Group, which would affect the, sort of contribute to the sustained activism by the United Kingdom into this region? This is my question. Perhaps it's not just the governmental calculation, but there is some ground, supportive ground, perhaps. Now, Professor Aoi seems to have questions about the sustainability of the UK's tilt based on the weakening UK economy. And you have already mentioned in your talk. Now, I would like to phrase it slightly in a different way. Yes, UK has the weakest economies amongst G7, perhaps, especially after the Brexit. The COVID-19 sort of masked the structural weaknesses of UK economy, but now all the countries have just got out of this COVID-19. The UK is singled out as the weakest economy, although all others are pointing to the lesser growth and so on. But anyway, my question is, with high inflations and high energy costs, as you have mentioned, I just wonder to what extent this sort of weakened economy contribute to the social unrest inside the Great Britain. We have overheard this, demonstrations and social unrest and so on in England, and I just wonder to what extent that is serious. And combined with that, over the past 7 or 8 years, we discussed, the risks of developed democracies called populism. Now, it seems to me that the magma, the deeper reasons for the populism are still there underneath. Combined with the sort of growing social unrest in the United Kingdom, to what extent the post-COVID, post-Ukraine, the post-Brexit, triple crisis of the United Kingdom dents the foundations of UK democracy, which might affect the the sustained remarkable sustained efforts by the UK government to this region. And you have effectively mentioned also about the Ukraine war in Ukraine that would contribute to the lack of resources, perhaps in the Pacific. I just overheard that just read the report by the ex-military of the United States, turned journalist now, that the US has supplied so many the military equipment and so on to Ukraine, to the extent that they are only having a minimum level required for their own security, and in some cases below that level. I just wonder if you have the same sort of situations in Great Britain or not, and would it affect the sustained assistance to Ukraine, and hence perhaps contribute to the resourcing of the in this part of the world. And finally, I'd like to ask, you are the ambassador to North Korea. So I just wondered, when you talk about the tilt to this Indo-Pacific, and then especially the military, exercises, growing presence in this region by the United States, United Kingdom. I just wonder the remaining sort of the military structure coming from the age of the Korean War. The UN still has a headquarters in Seoul or near Seoul, and we have a still sort of rare command in Yokota and so on for the Korean contingencies. Is it usable in case of contingencies in this part of the world, wider, not just Korean Peninsula? More specifically, the Taiwan Strait, but China is a P5, so this UN command, rare command, it is sort of designated to the Korean contingency. So perhaps it cannot be used at all, but the structure may be sort of employed, perhaps. I just wondered how it is related or unrelated. This is my question. Now, do I have still more time, or it's better to stop perhaps here? Yeah. I just wonder because I haven't had the talk with the ex British diplomat for a long time. I just yes, perhaps the tilt to the Indo-Pacific region itself is an answer, perhaps. But it used to be a talk of British diplomacy with three circles. One, special relationship with the United States, and the relationship with close relationship with Europe, and the historical ties with the British Commonwealth nations. But the special relationship with the United States may not have been functioning as used to be, perhaps, and you got out of the Europe since 2020, and the Commonwealth nations seems to be sort of having a sort of not really disintegrating, but they are having a diverse and divergent views, especially after the passing away of the Queen. So I just wondered how in the middle to long term time frame, how would you sort of depict the entire UK diplomatic strategy? I'm sure this tilt to the Indo-Pacific is part of the answer, but that is not the only region in this world. So I just would like to ask you this global view. Thank you.
Yes, you may.
Well, Professor Endo, thank you very much for your questions. I think we've bitten off more than we can chew today. And I apologize for not sticking to half an hour, because we could easily have spent an hour on these topics. Please remind me of questions you've asked when I don't pick them up. I mean, on your last question about the entire strategy of British diplomacy, I don't think I can answer that, but the integrated review makes clear the importance of the UK's alliance with the United States. But it also talks about the UK's presence in different organizations and groupings. And I think that you're right, that the tilt to the Indo-Pacific, which reflects the importance of the Indo-Pacific, does illustrate the way the UK is working in the Indo-Pacific with countries there, respecting and reflecting their interests and taking account of the UK's own capabilities. And I think that is applied more widely. I would add to that I think there's an interesting question about the US approach. And I think if you look at the US approval for the UK working with Japan on a future fighter aircraft, or if you look at the AUKUS arrangements, I think the US also is working with different groups and recognizing that while it remains, if you like, the only superpower, it is challenged by China and needs to work with others. On North Korea, DPRK, you raised a range of issues. I think in relation to the United Nations Command, I mean, the UK was a sending state in the Korean War, and I think that was very important and still important for the UK and its engagement and diplomacy in the region. But I don't think that the United Nations Command is really a model that one could reapply elsewhere. And I think the issue partly arises not in relation to the United Nations Command, but in relation to US forces Korea, of what would happen if there were conflict in the Taiwan Strait, and what that would result in terms of a reaction by Korea, and how the United States would make sure that it continued to have that trigger force in the Republic of Korea. Just final point in relation to the United Nations Command, obviously there's an armistice agreement rather than an end to the war. And so this is one of two areas, the other being the 5-power defense arrangements with Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand that the UK has, where there is a question of what legal obligations the United Kingdom has in relation to a conflict. Sticking with the DPRK, but talking about about North Korea, I think you're right that the primary motivation of the DPRK and the regime that runs it, the Kim regime, the monolithic leadership system, is the preservation of the DPRK under that system and the preservation of the ruling family. And so fundamentally, its development of ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons, its illegal development of these systems, is for deterrence. But the DPRK issued this year, or in 2022, a new doctrine, if you like, in relation to its nuclear weapons use, which does not rule out first use and does not rule out the use of the weapons, not just as a deterrent, but in conflict. So I think there are very real risks there. Just in relation to tactical nuclear weapons, which the DPRK has been developing, I think that this greatly increases the risks. And when I was the British ambassador in Pyongyang, I had a discussion with the Korean People's Army, the forces, when our non-resident defense attaché visited Pyongyang, I think in 2017, it might have been 2016. And the visiting defense attaché said, well, he made all the points about the fact that the United States doesn't have missiles deployed, nuclear weapons deployed to the Korean Peninsula, and that it wouldn't use nuclear weapons. That was his view, the defense attaché's view, in the Korean Peninsula. And the response that we received from the general who I met at the KPA was that he didn't believe that that applied in relation to tactical nuclear weapons. Well, I'm sure it does in relation to the United States, but I think that that was a sign that even then the DPRK was considering tactical nuclear weapons, and that perhaps it saw there being a different threshold in relation to use of tactical nuclear weapons from others. So I think the risks are very great. Just also in relation to the development of the DPRK's weapon systems, which have included hypersonics, maneuverable re-entry vehicles, the difficulty of detecting those missiles in flight is very considerable. And you saw that in different ranges declared by the Republic of Korea and Japan previously in monitoring test flights. So you referred to concerns about whether, or issues about whether China has the capability to monitor everything. I think it's not only China that finds this challenging, but I wouldn't myself, I'm not a military expert, and I'm certainly not an expert on the Chinese military. I wouldn't underestimate developing Chinese capability. I think you are, you may well be right. Obviously, there are different views expressed by different people about the likelihood in the immediate term or the near term of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. You know, I think I won't actually engage with what you've said about strengthened leadership in China. I'm not sure I call it dictatorship, but following the 20th Party Congress, certainly the reinforcement of Xi Jinping's position, and probably the reduction in sage advice he gets from people dissenting from any view he might express, and you know, intent to ensure that Taiwan does not become independent is very clear, and growing levels of capability. I think the importance of deterrence of, if it can be achieved, of non-peaceful unification of Taiwan is critical, and is brought out by the war in Ukraine. Just in relation to China, clearly there are other issues. There's the non-respect for UNCLOS, the United Nations Conference on Law of the Sea, and that is an issue that I talked about last year, but of great importance to the United Kingdom. Respect for UNCLOS, not just in relation to freedom of navigation and rights, and the extent of territorial claims in the South China and East China Sea, but globally, which is a reason for engaging there. Clearly, there are issues to do with Chinese coercion, economic coercion, attempts to suppress freedom of speech elsewhere, which of great concern to the UK. You mentioned Hong Kong. I should have mentioned Hong Kong. The UK has, in 2022, issued, or since 2020, has issued visas to 144,000 Hong Kong holders of British national overseas passports and their dependents as part of the response to the violation of the joint agreement between the United Kingdom and Hong Kong, which has the force, the United Kingdom and the People's Republic of China, which has the force of an international legal treaty. In terms of opinion about China, I think there are different people engaging with China in different ways. I think the view that there is a need to guard against, in relation to cybersecurity, to protect the critical national infrastructure, has gained ground and is quite widely held. There are still differences of view on the extent to which economic engagement with China is possible and desirable, but it is the policy of the British government, and it's the policy of the Labour government, the Labour opposition, sorry, should they become government in future, to continue to develop trade with China, trade and investment outside these areas that risk national security. But you know, we didn't talk about it, but the question of over-reliance on China arises much more starkly for economies like the United Kingdom, but also for the United States and others than it does in relation to Russia. And of course, there's the whole issue of Taiwan and semiconductors, which we can't go into now. In terms of British military capability and questions raised by the conflict in the Ukraine, I'm sure that a lot of work will be done on the question of, you know, what capabilities were needed in Ukraine, what that means for the UK's own defense commitment. I already referred to the supply challenge in relation to ammunition, and I didn't refer, but could have done, to the fact that Liz Truss wanted to increase expenditure on British defense to 3% of GDP, and that was uncosted. I think was unachievable even at the time she was talking about it, and is certainly unachievable now following what happened to her government. But that doesn't mean that there aren't defense needs, and that if one were able to devote more resource to it, one would do so. But the same is true for health, for education, and for other areas as well. In terms of a golden age of relations with Japan, I think the UK has been very clear about the importance of the security relationship with Japan, defense and security. Obviously, it's a like-minded country. Clearly, there's been an important trade and investment relationship. But despite the comprehensive economic partnership agreement, actually the volume of trade between the United Kingdom and Japan has not kept pace with some other countries in the region in terms of their trade with the United Kingdom. But the commitment to the relationship is as strong as ever.
Yeah, questions? Right, thank you very much. I want to spend the last 1 or 2 minutes picking up some questions from the audience. We actually have a few questions about India and the UK relation, and also Sri Lanka. So I will combine those. So is India's stance on the Russia-Ukraine war likely to have any significant consequences for the India-UK relationship? And also, do the fact that Prime Minister Sunak has Indian ancestry and the fact that India used to be the British colonies, does have any impact on the relationship? And also, what is the strategic place of Sri Lanka for the UK? So if you could answer very quickly, please.
I don't know if Professor ENDO wants to come in on these points. I actually had a number of other countries that I was going to mention in my talk in relation to 2022, one of which was Sri Lanka. I would only say that in terms of the economic and political crisis in Sri Lanka in 2022, I'm not actually party to the engagement that the British government may have had with Sri Lanka, but I didn't feel that the UK was from the press reporting that I was seeing, was terribly prominent in dealing with the crisis in Sri Lanka, despite the very close Commonwealth ties. And I would contrast that, for instance, with the action that the UK has taken in the United Nations in relation to Myanmar, where the UK has led in many ways in the response to the coup in Myanmar, or the reaction to the floods in Pakistan, where the UK, despite the pressures on the aid budget, has been a major donor. Those are huge questions relating to India. The UK has set out a roadmap to 2030 for its relations with India, which covers a number of areas. I think the United Kingdom, I can't actually speak for the government, I'm not from the government, but I'm sure that the government in the United Kingdom, as elsewhere, recognizes India's view of a sort of non-aligned kind, and that it is not likely to make exactly the same statements or take exactly the same actions in relation to Russia that the United States or the United Kingdom has taken. Nevertheless, working with India in the defense area is extremely important. The UK has increased its defense cooperation with India as part of the Carrier Strike Group. There were joint exercises. The UK is not a part of the Quad grouping, but works closely with India. The UK is in discussion with India about defense cooperation, and there are major questions for India about its reliance on Russia for weapon systems, which arise regardless of what position India may take in relation to the criticism of Russia, because the commitment of Russia to the continuing war in Ukraine calls into question the ability of Russia to supply India. So I think there is a need for India will determine its own needs, it won't listen to me, to diversify its sources of supply. In terms of the fact that Rishi Sunak is of Indian origin by way of East Africa from his family's movement, I think he says it's a living symbol of the links between the countries. I do think that the diaspora in the UK is important. I mentioned 9.3% of the population of England and Wales identifying as Asian. Of that, the largest grouping is Indian, and then Pakistani and Bangladeshi. I think this is important for trade, for investment, for other forms of cooperation, people-to-people exchanges, but it is not going to lead to the solution of all issues. And it doesn't mean that the UK and India will agree on everything, and that the negotiations over a free trade agreement, which are in train, are going to be easy. They will continue to be challenging, with both countries looking to maximize their interests.
Well, thank you so much. So we are running out of time. So I'd like to conclude today's session. And I would like to thank you once again for Professor Morgan for your insightful lecture and Professor Endo for your comments. And we also thank for the audience for staying with us. And you can find the latest information of Tokyo College through our website, mail, magazine, and SNS. So please stay tuned. And we are looking for your participation in the future too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.